Well, it's a war that the left doesn't dare name. They will not call it Islamic extremists. They're poor people. They're just locked in a cycle of poverty. And because of their poverty, they're trying to break through and get attention from the rest of us that are such bigots. Well, this guy looked like a homeless man, but he turned out to be the man wanted in connection with the bombing of the New York City on Saturday. Now he's in custody, and he could face federal charges. And the biggest thing is he is a Muslim.
Ahmad Khan Rahami is being held on $5 million bail. Heather Sells brings us this report on how he was captured and how terrorism is once again a key issue in the presidential race.
The manhunt for Ahmad Khan Rahami started in New York City and ended in a burst of gunfire in New Jersey.
There's a guy shooting a gun, shots fired.
Just hours after police sent out a text alert and released this image, the owner of a Linden, New Jersey bar saw a man sleeping in his hallway and called police. The responding officer immediately recognized him.
Within a matter of seconds, the suspect fired on him.
A bulletproof vest saved the officer. Rahami then fled on foot, shooting randomly as other officers fired back, eventually taking him down.
Oh man, it was wild.
A bloodied Rahami was loaded into an ambulance just over 2 days after the first blast in Manhattan. A shrapnel-packed pressure cooker bomb wounded 29 people Saturday night, but none seriously. Hours later, investigators discovered another pressure cooker just blocks away. And Sunday night, authorities discovered 5 pipe bombs at a New Jersey train station. What led them to Rahami, a fingerprint and DNA from one of the New York sites, and surveillance video from the bombing scene. What we now know about Rahami is this: he is a naturalized American citizen, born in Afghanistan. He lived with his family above their restaurant in Elizabeth, New Jersey. A childhood friend says he visited Afghanistan several years ago and came back as a more religious person. On the campaign trail, both Clinton and Trump have used the bombings to highlight their differences.
Attack after attack. From 9/11 to San Bernardino, we have seen how failures to screen who is entering the United States puts all of our citizens, everyone in this room, at danger. So let me state very, very clearly, immigration security is national security.
We know that a lot of the rhetoric we've heard from Donald Trump has been seized on by terrorists, in particular ISIS, because they are looking to make this into a war against Islam. Rather than a war against jihadists, violent terrorists, people who number in the maybe tens of thousands, not the tens of millions.
Authorities have charged Rahami with 5 counts of attempted murder of police after his gunfight with them. Federal prosecutors are still weighing charges connected to the bombings, and they're still trying to determine a motive and whether or not Rahami acted alone. Heather Sells, CBN News.
I wish for once that Hillary Clinton would get a copy of the Quran or the Hadith and just read it. Just read what it says. Read those passages in it that talks about killing the infidels. Read those passages that talks about going after the, quote, crusaders. Read what it says about establishing a caliphate, and then, and then you'll begin to see that indeed what we're dealing with is a religion. It is a system of government that is cloaked inside of a religious garb. Well, before he leaves office, President Obama is making sure he's leaving his mark behind. Look at this. I'm choking.
Called midnight regulations. Rules a president can get through at the last minute before he leaves office, and Republicans in Congress are unable to stop them. One research fellow at the Heritage Foundation tells Roll Call President Obama has been in a different league in terms of heavy regulations, and leading Senate Republicans say the president is trying to do by regulation what he can't do through legislation from Congress. Texas Senator John Cornyn says his constituents complain about strangling rules from the EPA, Labor Department, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Pat, back to you.
It's absolutely shocking. The left, ladies and gentlemen, the so-called progressives want one thing. They want to bring socialized life to America, and they want to control every aspect of the life you and I live. They want to have control over health care, over banking, over industry, over labor relations, over the schools, over everything. And they think a small group of, quote, elites in Washington know more about how to run this government than 300 million Americans know. Well, that's not true, but that's what they feel, and Obama is trying his dead level best to impose his view of socialism on this nation. And I think we need to call it what it is. He's a radical socialist, and he was nurtured in the school of radical, whatever you call it, revolution. And his teachers are those who hate America. And, you know, here he is as President of the United States, and the Congress says basically we can't do anything to stop him. Well, the only thing we can do to stop him is put another president who could reverse all those rules, but that's what we're looking at right now. But it will control everything you do, and it will be death to this country. John?
Pat, Congress is trying to reach a deal on next year's federal budget, which includes a measure to fight the Zika virus. But lawmakers hit a major roadblock because of a big disagreement on where some of that Zika prevention funding should go. Jenna Browder has the story.
It's a dire situation. Thousands of Americans infected by the Zika virus. Those most at risk, pregnant women and their unborn babies. But for months, little help from Washington.
The White House asked for emergency Zika funding back in February, but ran into some problems on Capitol Hill. One of its sticking points was whether or not some of the funding should go to Planned Parenthood.
The $1.1 billion bill is designed to fund research to find a vaccine for Zika and also help control the mosquito population. The bill also included a smaller amount for some public health efforts. Republicans said none of that money could go to Planned Parenthood. Democrats objected, though, and held up the bill 3 times, despite saying for months that the funding had been needed right away. Democrats said women often had no other place to go, but Republicans argued the Democrats were simply protecting one of their special interests and pointed out that President Obama's original Zika funding request didn't mention Planned Parenthood, and the bill did allow Planned Parenthood to possibly get more federal money, although not directly. Many pro-life conservatives were unhappy because the move could have meant more taxpayer money for Planned Parenthood. Some Republicans, like Senator Marco Rubio, said they were willing to compromise.
I think one of the fundamental obligations of the federal government is to keep us safe, including from a public health threat such as this.
And he hoped other lawmakers agreed. The Zika bill is attached to next year's spending bill, which Congress must pass by the end of the month to avoid a government shutdown. Meantime, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has been watching and waiting.
By the end of this month, we will be out of money to respond effectively.
And many said that the vote would be not a moment too soon for the millions of Americans on edge. Reporting in Orlando, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
And the impasse appears to be resolved, and it looks like Planned Parenthood's affiliated clinics in Puerto Rico will get some direct federal funding. Well, imagine living where civil war has led to horrible atrocities like mass gang rape, and where young kids are being recruited as child soldiers. That's what's happening today in South Sudan, and now actor and activist George Clooney says he has evidence that South Sudan's president and top leaders are actually profiting from this deadly war. George Thomas brings us that story.
Salva Kiir became South Sudan's president in 2011. But since then, tens of thousands of people have lost their lives, many of them civilians, as a conflict pitting him and rival political leaders have gripped the nation. Now, Hollywood actor and activist George Clooney is blaming Kiir and his rivals of making fortunes from the deadly conflict.
We're prepared to give evidence of massive criminal behavior by the president of South Sudan and by his opposition, the ousted vice president of South Sudan and their generals.
Clooney, who co-founded a human rights organization called the Sentry, says a 2-year investigation found that South Sudan's warring parties had manipulated and exploited ethnic divisions in order to build up wealth for themselves.
The simple fact is, they're stealing the money to fund their militias to attack and kill one another.
It's all found in a new report called War Crimes Shouldn't Pay, Stopping the Looting and Destruction in South Sudan. Clooney claims politicians who earn modest salaries are suddenly amassing fortunes with help from offshore properties and business deals.
It involves arms dealers, international lawyers, international banks, international real estate.
South Sudan's government called the report rubbish and misleading. Still, John Prendergast, a human rights activist who co-founded the Sentry Group with Clooney, says what's happening in South Sudan is tantamount to war crimes, and the country's leaders are getting away with it.
South Sudan leaders no longer take seriously the threats made by the United Nations, by the United States, and others to impose consequences for their behavior.
The country was plunged into conflict in 2013 following a dispute between Kiir and his political rival, former Vice President Riek Machar. South Sudan gained independence 5 years ago, becoming the newest nation to enter the global community. Since then, the political situation in this country has been tumultuous, to say the least. The two main political parties have been fighting each other, vying for influence, and just haven't been able to come together. In recent months, both sides have resorted to brutal acts, including mass gang rape.
South Sudan's leaders have learned that rape as a war weapon, child soldier recruitment, and mass killings are not enough to trigger any meaningful accountability measures.
Prendergast says the international community must do more to crack down on banks and other institutions that are being used by politicians to funnel millions.
We're proposing to combine anti-money laundering measures with targeted sanctions focused on the top leaders, accompanied by robust enforcement.
Clooney claims their investigation clearly shows that in South Sudan, it pays to commit war crimes. And if it isn't stopped, the consequences could be devastating.
The United States and the world recognizes that South Sudan cannot become a failed state, not simply because of the humanitarian crisis, but also because we have seen the influences that can take hold in a failed state. We can either take action now or we can spend the next decade mopping up the mess.
George Thomas, CBN News, South Sudan.
Thanks, George. Pat, so much suffering in South Sudan's 5 short years as a country.
I'm shocked at this because what we were concerned about was the brutality of the Muslim regime in the northern part of Sudan. And those in the South Sudan were supposed to be Christians. They were supposed to be freedom-loving people. And suddenly we've got this swamp in there of sectarian violence and brutality. It shocks me because we were looking for a democracy to come forth, and we all applauded the emergence, at least I all applauded the emergence of this fledgling nation. It has a good supply of oil, I might add, and it has the way of self-sustaining itself. But to think that this kind of atrocity is going on is just, to me, is horrifying. I can't believe it. Terry, it makes me very sad.
Well, greed and power do
Yeah.
Greed and power do bad things.
Well, I know, but my goodness, these were supposed to be the good guys.
Yeah, well, and often that happens.
Yeah,
you know,
well,
I guess it's really a test of where
it's a
they're
shame.
really coming from.
All right, well,
it is.
That's the way it is. Okay.